We're doing it.
We're doing it. I'm excited to talk about vulnerability.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Mm.
I would love to start with a definition.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah. I believe it is exposed to the possibility of being hurt or harmed.
Mm-hmm.
How does that feel for you?
Yeah. It could be mentally, emotionally, spiritually,
Physically.
physically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exposure to harm or pain.
Well, the opening oneself up to the potential for being hurt. Yeah. And what are you excited to talk about?
I
What
just love
excites you?
vulnerability. I did a poll on my stories recently asking about where people felt like their personal relationships were lacking, and emotional depth was one of them. And we've talked about vulnerability in relationships a couple times, both on our independent Instagrams and together. We even did a live on
did.
Can men be too vulnerable in relationships?
We did.
And it was super powerful.
Yeah, and it sparked a lot of conversation in people.
So much. I mean, out of the poll that even we asked, like, can men be too vulnerable in relationship? It was actually very divided, with about like 55% saying yes and 45% saying no. And when I dug in to everybody a little bit deeper to say,
Yeah.
hey, I'm curious about your response, would you love to share? Every response kind of came with a yes, but, or a no, and. And so it's like, well, is it actually a no? And digging into it a little bit more, it seems like there is a resounding no. Men can't be too vulnerable in relationships, provided that the relationship does not become the emotional dumping ground, provided that they're able to self-resource or outsource in other ways. So it's not just a codependent relationship on their feminine partner to hold space for them. And I imagine that it's the same for men. I imagine that men don't want to be the caretaker and the only caretaker of a woman's emotions. I imagine there's benefit to going other places, like my girls, and sharing some of what's on my heart.
Yeah, and I think that really nicely speaks into the difference between masculine and feminine when it comes to emotional vulnerability. Would you say that by nature women tend to have more ability, capacity to be vulnerable emotionally compared to men?
Yeah. I think naturally, yes. And the way that we're conditioned, yes. When trauma comes in, it gets a bit murky. But in general, like, women are the emotional bodies. Like, we are the water body. We are the ocean. We are innately more attuned and in tune with our emotions than men are.
Yeah.
But I also wonder, like, let's say society didn't condition men the way that they did, which clearly there's a reason why they do it, and also there's like a fault to why they do it. I wonder if we took the conditioning away, if men would actually be equally as emotional, or if it is strictly biological.
Well, I feel like the societal disparity is there because of an inherent biological difference that resides between masculine and feminine. I mean, if you think back, the role of the masculine was warrior. There's a requirement for there to be some removal of emotional vulnerability, because that doesn't align with being, the role of the masculine typically is invulnerability. It's strength. It's warrior. It's protector. Those aren't qualities that align with overly vulnerable. Whereas inherently for women, or the feminine, the vulnerability is quite literally built in, because in bearing children, in being pregnant, you're naturally in a more vulnerable state. And then there is the requirement for the masculine to adopt the role of protector and take on that deficit.
Yeah.
So it feels like that they're built in, because if both were equally vulnerable, then how would that
Where
work?
would there be polarity?
Right. And safety.
Yeah. Yeah, even what you're saying around just like the reason why men are conditioned the way they are, immediately my mind goes to military, right? It's the same in military. Like vulnerability could be life or death.
Right.
And so you get trained to not feel, think, and act and respond in the quickest, shortest amount of time possible, right? You have to protect. And that's kind of what, I mean, they're training that instinct to be so deeply instilled that I know coming out of situations like that, military personnel or veterans have a hard time reconnecting to their emotions because it's been so drilled out of their experience.
Right. It's gone to the extreme of the polarity.
Yeah.
Because the circumstance requires it.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that speaks into the natural difference between masculine and feminine energetics, which then typically aligns to male-female embodiment. That's not to say that there is a one-to-one. Like, just because you're in a male body doesn't mean you can't be masculine and feminine energetically endowed, bestowed.
Yeah, and this isn't just speaking to gender roles either.
Right.
These are just
Exactly.
like two labels to different poles.
Right. Energetic poles.
Yeah. So it's more about like masculine essence, feminine essence.
Yeah.
Me being predominantly in my feminine essence, I am an emotional being. I am very intuitive. I'm very in tune with my feelings and my emotions in ways that which I used to suppress them. I now fully express them, no fear. And yeah, it's the same where even in our question around can men be too vulnerable, what I'm seeing in society is that men are kind of going through this like upheaval, and they're cosmically, naturally kind of being forced to look at the emotions that have been suppressed.
Yeah.
And are looking for safe spaces to dive into those parts of themselves which were not safe enough to express before. And find that, and we're seeing that with like the emergence of a bunch of brotherhood groups, as well as wanting, it seems like, to connect to the feminine on a deeper level, and noticing what the boundary is in that, like what is too vulnerable in relationship for man in relationship, and also woman in relationship.
Yeah. Well,
is there such a thing as too vulnerable?
Well, yeah, this is interesting because what comes to me is I think naturally women don't want, and please correct me if I'm wrong from your own personal experience, women don't want a man who is completely devoid of emotional intelligence, because
No.
Right.
Definitely not.
And
I could just date AI if I wanted that.
maybe one day.
Get me a robot, maybe.
And I would assume women don't want a man who's completely at the other end of the spectrum of overly vulnerable with their emotions. Like it feels like there's a healthy balancing point where a man can be, or I'm going to just speak for myself, where I can be attuned into my vulnerability of emotional intelligence enough to connect with you and express myself, and not so consumed by that I'm just like a walking wreck all the time.
And I feel like, I mean, there is space, right? Like people have midlife crises. There's space where life just can crush us, and to have that safe space of maybe that like deeper emotional vulnerability is beautiful and it's valuable. Do women want that 24/7? My belief is no, and based upon what we've asked, my belief is also no, because at some point there is a risk of safety. If you're a mess all the time, I'm talking 24/7, you cannot keep it together for an extended period of time, at some point the woman's gonna have to then take a stand and cover that relationship, which naturally would put her in her more masculine essence. So now she has to provide the man, which for short term, that could be okay, right? We switch polarities all the time.
Right.
That can be okay. Long term, though, I can see how that would be incredibly destructive to the relationship, depending on what that couple's natural dynamics are.
Right.
So we have to take that into account also.
Yeah. It depends whether as an individual, you reside in your feminine energetic more or your masculine energetic more.
Yeah, and what you enjoy, you know. So if it is the opposite, if there is a woman who actually identifies with her masculine essence more, and she's dating a man who identifies in his feminine essence more, that polarity works. There's nothing wrong with that polarity at all. Those are the poles that have attracted them into that space. That's the dynamic that works for them, and that's amazing too. And should that switch, you know, like maybe I feel like the same issues would occur just on the other foot.
Sure, I agree. Yeah, so it feels like it's a managing of the polarities in a way that best serves the natural balancing of the dynamic. Because what I feel with the difference between the two is that with the vulnerability piece for the masculine, it's an opportunity to drop the arms and de-armor and allow to be seen, like to have the courage to be seen at a deeper level. And with that comes trust that it will be held for that period of time where the healing needs to occur until it's time to armor up again and arm up again. And it's the feminine that has the capacity to transmute that emotional energy because they're more in tune with the emotional energetics.
Yeah, our capacity to hold emotions, I mean, taking back to like pregnancy, right? Like that, there's so much pain. I mean, I remember even seeing videos of police officers getting these devices strapped to them that indicate period pain, you know? And so they have it on a scale of 1 to 10, and it's these like machismo cops are like suffering. They are suffering, you know? And it's like, oh, we go through that every 28 days, you know? Like our ability and our capacity to hold pain, to hold emotion in general is so deep and so wide. That's our gift. It really is our gift. And for me, it's like when any man, whether this is my clients, whether that's in relationship, whether it's between you and I, even in my male friendships, when men come to me with vulnerability, I really see that as like they are coming to me with the deepest parts of their heart. And for me, I feel like that's also a gift to be able to hold that space and love them and nurture them in a way where I'm not projecting who they should be or they need to be strong or buck up, buttercup. I'm not saying anything like that. It's like it's such a gift where, okay, these are the maybe instances where a man can go, okay, I'm going to take my armor off because I'm carrying armor 24/7 all day. They're kind of in protection mode. As a man, your default is warrior energy, right? You're always kind of on the lookout. Yeah, exactly. For when something could threaten, like you're the call to arms.
Right.
And so giving men the opportunity to lay that to rest and have this moment of vulnerability can be so beautiful in relationship. I feel like it actually really fosters that emotional depth piece that some people have mentioned they feel like are lacking in their relationships. For whatever reason, maybe it's not being safely held. Maybe there's just too much volatility in the dynamic in the first place that then that vulnerability is perceived as weakness, or they do come under attack.
But this is the thing for me, I think, in past relationships, maybe in this, like at the beginning, is it safe for me to be vulnerable, or is it going to be perceived as weakness? Like, and I think that's the key point for me, at least, is I you know, by being in a male body and adopting the role of the masculine, being asked to, or it's my role to be invulnerable. And in those moments where I feel the desire to be vulnerable, how will that be perceived? Will that be held, or will I be chastised for it?
That's why I feel like even us having the conversation around vulnerability helps that, because now I feel like there's such a clear line of communication between us where you know that you can come to me with your vulnerability and that I will hold you in it, because I know what's underneath that, and it's this energetic, right? Like, if I show up in vulnerability, how will you receive it? Like, will you castrate me, or will you actually hold me in it, or like emasculate me? And without having that conversation, I could see how at some point the opposite might have been true for me, where I might have actually been nervous or worried. But it's like, no, okay, you already came to me with like what I feel like is the vulnerability of all vulnerabilities, right? It's like, hey, I'm fearful that if I show up to you in vulnerability, that you will think less of me, and that you will think that I'm less capable or able as a man. To me, that's like the mecca of male vulnerability, to express that statement. Because then, now knowing that that's actually what's at the root and the fear of the vulnerability, anytime that is to happen in the future, then I know it's like, okay, I'm going to hold this, because your key fear is that at some point I might believe that, okay, you actually can't carry this anymore.
Right.
There's a massive compassionate piece that came through for me when we had that conversation, because it was like, oh, okay, it's not just you coming and expressing your vulnerability. There's still something at the root of that could have a hold of you. That fear could always be there. And knowing that, okay, I get to hold that and ensure that I also hold you to that standard. So if at some point I actually did feel that way, it was like, hey, I'm feeling a bit like our safety as a couple is now at risk.
Yeah.
What do we need to do here? It becomes a conversation about that, about collaboration.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I'm glad that we had that conversation. One, because I felt like it helped you, or it invited you to understand what was going on with me, which is, great. And two, it also invited you to give me a responsibility piece, whereby, yes, you can show up in your vulnerability, that's fine, and I will hold you in that, but I will not take responsibility for it. It's like, you don't get to become the little boy and I'm going to be your mother. You don't get to stay in that space.
Yeah.
You bring it to me, we work through it as a team. I will help you transmute that, because that's my gift, in order to get you back to wherever it is you need to be. And that's the responsibility piece. It's like, I have permission, it feels like I have permission from you, if something comes up, to be vulnerable in it, because you are holding me to a standard of getting back to myself. And that feels great, because I feel safe to express myself. And I know that in doing so, it's part of me doing what I need to do to get back to the protector role that you want from me.
Yeah, it's like a loving space of recalibration.
Yes.
Right? It's like, I'm feeling this infraction point. It's having an effect on me. I would love to bring it to the altar of us, share it with you, potentially get feedback, or maybe just be seen and heard. And then it's like, okay, amazing. Like, even my role is not to fix your problem.
Right.
I'm not going to fix your problem. Even if I have solutions, I'll offer them.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do that work, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And what it does is it gives me an opportunity to reflect back at you what you're experiencing, and then ask you, well, what could some possible solutions, like what do you need to get back to your heart, right? To get back to your power. And you'll know what that is. You'll already know what that is, but I'm there to ask that. And so it's like then the journey to get back to that is yours. You have the soundboard here. You have the safe space to express that here. Anything else or anything that you feel like you can't bring to me, you have men, you have brothers, you have other community to bring it to. That's also important. Because what I hear feedback on so much is how relationships just become emotional dumping grounds, and nobody wants that. It's just so toxic, and it's very challenging for couples to get out of that space. I feel like it actually ends up just destroying a majority of, at least the people that I personally know, it's destroyed their relationships because there's too much energy there, and there's too much resentment there, because there's not either an appropriate understanding of what's actually underneath the vulnerability and why a man chooses to express it to a woman in that moment, and also women's capacity to hold it in a healthy way that's just holding it. It's not ours to take on. It's not ours to assume. It's not ours to fix.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sharing this with you because I want you to fix it. I'm sharing it with you because I need help holding it whilst I fix it.
Exactly. Or even while I'm in the process or experience of it. You're coming to me as a safe space to be in process.
Yes.
Right? And that's my gift, to hold that.
Because you have the gift of being able to hold that. It's like if I could do it myself, I would. But in this moment I can't because I don't have the ability to.
I think what would be really valuable is if we talk just for a brief minute about what holding space actually means.
Okay.
For people who don't understand, like, okay, holding space, like, what is that? What does it actually look like to hold space for another person? Because I feel like this term gets thrown around a lot, and there's still a lot of people out there, they're just like, what does that even mean to, like, hold? How do I hold space?
You just put your hands like this.
Hold on me. Take this, I take this, take this.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Because holding space is a really key part of being able to have and share vulnerability. If either person can't hold space, it's doomed from the beginning.
It's less likely to be
I went a bit apocalyptic there, but
yeah.
Yeah, it's less likely to be successful because the energies get murky, right?
It feels like if neither people are able to hold space, then you're constantly in need of someone who is like a mediator. Like this counseling.
It's like, I can't handle what you're sharing with me, and then I'm going to put that on you, and then we're in this cycle where nobody's really holding space for anybody. It gets a bit combative, can get a bit combative and defensive.
Yeah.
Because there's no person or energy that is grounded, right? That's what I feel like holding space is rooted in, is one's ability to stay grounded, to not assume or take responsibility for or project in response to what is being offered.
Yeah, like for me, I'd build on that by saying that holding space is the removal of the ego self. I'm not David right now when I'm holding space for you. Like, I put all of my stuff over there, and I'm just a container for you to express, and it has nothing to do with me. It's nothing about me. I'm projecting nothing. I'm not receiving anything. You can say what you want about me to me, and it just ding ding ding. It just parries off.
Yeah.
Because it's not me who's receiving it.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like that was important to mention. Like,
sure. And
the permission piece too. We talk about this a lot. It's like, hey, I have something challenging I'd like to express. Can you hold space for me? Like, AKA, are you in a grounded enough state, non-distracted enough state where you can be present with what I'm about to share? And can you hold that? Can you hold that charge? Hold it while I have this experience, and then whatever we need to do from that state or place can then be brought to the table.
Yeah. And you're allowed to say no.
Yeah, you're totally allowed to say no.
And in doing that, it's as if you're saying, can you just remove yourself from this exchange for this duration of time whilst I express, emote, and it's not easy.
No, it takes a lot of personal power. I mean, I know even when you first started coming to me, because I was still feeling like a bit jarred from previous relationship, where it's like, hey, can you hold space for me? My nervous system would go, oh fuck, oh my god, all systems fired, and I would have to sit there and like, okay, am I actually in a space to hold space? And I would answer honestly and authentically. And at some point, it's like, okay, when I say yes, I'd go in this internal process that goes, okay, this could be anything. We can hold space for all of it, even if it's about our dynamic. Let's say it's a negative thing you're experiencing about our dynamic. Then even in those moments when I hear it and I'm receiving it, I still have to choose. I have to make a conscious choice to hold my center and let you express yourself. Not allow my defenses to come in. Not allow an attitude to show up. Not allow, well, you did blah, blah, blah. Like, I have to hold it, right? It's like holding it down. To hold it down and go. Even if that means sometimes just like gulping it back and be like, thank you for expressing those things. Thank you for expressing those things. I'm okay. I'm holding it. I'm still holding it. And then going later and discharging.
Right.
It's like the ability to hold the energetic charge of what's being offered and then going on my own way or discharging it together or however we want to work through that.
So how I'm interpreting that is in holding space, it's what's the word? It's taking on not to make it about yourself. It's I accept and honor to not make this about me in whatever it is you're about to share.
Yeah. Even if some part of my ego wants to perceive that it is about me.
Right. Yeah. It's holding that part of yourself down and going, no, this isn't about me right now. I'm not in this space. This is about the person in front of me and whatever it is that they come to me and trusting me to be vulnerable with.
And I think vulnerability, there's such a caveat between vulnerability and communication, because this takes me back to the previous episode that we recorded around how a person chooses to express their vulnerability. If they're not owning their experience, it makes that vulnerable discussion and holding space more challenging. So when you show up in vulnerability and you own that it's your experience, I find that it's actually easier for me to hold that space, because it's like, okay, cool, I'm not receiving any projections, I'm not being gaslit, I'm not being pointed, shamed, or blamed. It's like that allows me to hold that experience for you with more ease and more strength.
He's saying that you're able to do that because you know that I'm not trying to make it about you. I'm taking responsibility for whatever it is that I'm sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when there's that ownership piece of these are my emotions and this is what I'm experiencing. Let's say if it was about our relationship, knowing that you're owning it and hearing the way that you're communicating that also disarms me.
Right.
So I don't have to go, even if I feel like, even if it's about me in particular, an action that I took, I don't have to feel defensive about it, because you're not blaming me for your experience. You're owning your experience.
I love this. I feel like it's such an important point to make. Is you and correct me if I feel like I haven't got the gist of it right. Is you're able to accept my vulnerability more easily because you understand that I understand that through my communications I'm being self-reflective. I'm not projecting onto. It's about me and my experience, which helps you remove yourself from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think totally.
There's a barrier that comes off there that goes, okay.
Yeah.
It also doesn't make me feel like I have to assume any responsibility in that regard. So.
And I feel like that's such an important distinction to make in the understanding between the communications, which then allows for vulnerability to come. Because in the vulnerability piece isn't, I need to tell you something about you. It's right. The vulnerability piece is, this is what's going on in me. You might be a part of it, but this is about me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah.
I think that's so powerful for both parties.
Mm.
It disarms the receiving party,
Uh-huh.
and it empowers
Yes.
the offering party.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm owning this. This is my experience. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it feels vulnerable. Yeah, I actually feel exposed in this moment to you. Because maybe normally I would just suppress it or I would just ignore it. But I'm choosing to lean into that for the sake of intimacy and greater emotional depth in our relationship. Because like when you show up in vulnerability, if you were not vulnerable ever, I wouldn't be able to feel your heart. And as the feminine, I would really struggle with that. Like, oh, you're just so locked in his brain all the time. I never feel his heart. He never brings me into his experience, to his emotional experience. And I feel like women do crave that. As much as we want security in the intellect and the providership, all of that's fun and great. But if we don't feel your heart, that's a big piece that misses. That goes missing for us. So it's like bringing your heart, your vulnerability to the altar is bringing your heart to me. And it allows me to see you in a way that the rest of the world doesn't get to see that. For me, I appreciate that. There's a lot of value in that. And for me, that really strengthens our bond.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that. Because there's this desire for you to see that side of me. To know that I have that, to know that I have that ability to express myself in that manner. And I think in part because it lets you know that I can empathize.
Yeah.
Because if I can't express my emotion, how can I understand yours?
Exactly.
Right.
It'd be so hard. It'd be so challenging. It's like you would, if I showed up with emotion, you would try to help me logic my way out of it. And sometimes that you can't do that. There's not always solutions. And my emotions are not a math problem or something that can be engineered or fabricated.
I've tried.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's
so
true.
having that, it creates a deeper space of understanding, of empathy, and just communication, right? It deepens our love, our ability to truly see each other underneath these more superficial layers. Like vulnerability is getting to the nitty-gritty of what causes a person to think, feel, and act the way that they do. Right? These infraction points all create an impact on how a person thinks about themselves and how they think about the world. And if we chose to never actually go into them and express them with somebody that we felt safe, we might continue to carry those beliefs, which become, honestly, in my opinion, a crutch, and perpetuate dissonance with the world around us.
So have you, in your experience, been in a relationship with men who struggled to be vulnerable?
To some degree. Yeah, I've definitely been in relationships where men have expressed their vulnerabilities more often. But I also just think about like my younger relationships where men were definitely not in tune with their emotions. It's like if something was challenging, they would say that something was challenging, but it was just all internalized.
Right.
You know, and me at that age, I wasn't like, bring me your emotions. I was just like, okay, you're going through something cool.
Right.
You know, it was just like I wasn't even in a state of craving the depth. I didn't even realize that relationships could be this deep.
Right.
So yeah, like my beginning stages for sure. And the more that my relationships have evolved, I tend to see the more vulnerable side of men. And also, I really believe that I pull that out like in the way that I love, in the way that I show up, and also in the way that I so freely express myself. My belief is that I give anybody I'm in relationship with permission to also be that expressive. And a lot of times I self-process, and I'll even do it out loud in relationships, and there's a lot of value in that. It's like, wow, that's how you went from this to this. Interesting. I never would have thought of it like that. And it kind of brings men into this space of examining their own emotional landscape and how they can work with the emotions that they have in a way that this would not think to their mind, would not ever think of, right? We talked about somatics.
Yes.
And like even that revelation in your experience is like interesting. I've never really thought about the somatic body in that way. As a way to like process what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting. I feel like there's a thread there to the acid experience that you had, the revelation that you had in the ability to hold emotion for the masculine.
Yeah, the story is so interesting because once we processed this after the fact, I learned that you had no idea what was happening. You have no recollection of what I was experiencing. And in the moment, I felt so deeply connected to you. Like it was such a psychic experience that I was having, and we were communicating, and you were responding to me out loud. But afterwards, you had no recollection of even like saying some of the things that you said, you know? And it was this moment where you were feeling particularly overwhelmed. Like you were in sensory overload. I mean, it was just like lost in the sauce. And I remember I just kept saying, we had taken LSD. We thought it was going to be a micro play, connect intimately, whatever. It was just like full on medicine journey. Like I'm like, I've done Bufo twice, and this took me way beyond Bufo. Like so wild.
Half a gummy is a quarter of a gummy too much.
Of this particular gummy.
Yeah.
And there's so much medicine in there. And in your overwhelm, I remember I kept saying, I was like, everything's all beautiful. Like at the end of the day, we're just two beings who are just like flat on the ground of this beautiful house. Like everything's okay. And I remember you kept saying like, you're so strong. You're so strong. Because you were just like, so everything was just overwhelming your system.
Yeah.
And we held hands and we tethered for our own safety. Because at some point I was like, okay, I can no longer hold space. I'm now dropping into a space that I have to surrender into. Let's just tether so we don't lose each other in this moment. And so we held hands. And it was our love tether. And through that tether, I could feel your overwhelm. And I remember having this very visceral experience that in my mind, I was like, welcome to the feminine experience, where everything is overwhelming because we're absorbing the energy and the emotions of all of society and all of the energy through us and out of us, through creation, through just what we receive as antenna energetic poles. And I remember chuckling to myself, like, welcome to the feminine experience. And I was just like holding you, and I felt all of your overwhelm just like surge into my body, and I was just holding it, and I was transmuting it into beauty in real time. And I was like, no, this gets to be beautiful. Like we just get to relax into it, find the beauty in this moment, and come back to the tether. Like when you're feeling overwhelmed, come back to this center point of love. And anytime the overwhelm would come, I would say, come back to this tether. And everything would absolve. All of a sudden you're like, oh my God, that's it. Like that's all I really have to do. And what that experience had showed me was like this reciprocal energy that man and woman have, where I am of the belief, and I'm a bit more traditional in this sense, that it can be or is of a woman's duty to be able to hold the fragility of man, because underneath all the armor and underneath all the strength, there is a little boy in there, and there is fragility in there, and the world is fucking rough. And so men get to have the experience of like, fuck, this is so fucking challenging, and where's the safe space that they want to discharge that is like in relationship, right? In the confines of what they consider to be the safest space for their heart, in union. So it gets to be our gift to hold men in their fragility, but then afterwards we have to do something with that. We need to go and discharge it, because when you offer your heart and your emotions, we feel that. It's different than when women offload their emotions to a man, and a man's like, oh, okay, great. What do you need? You know, like that's the end of the conversation, right? They're not really absorbing the energy.
Not alchemizing it in the same
Yeah, they
way.
don't alchemize it in that way. So we have to go and discharge it. And those are the moments where we are the most vulnerable energetically. And so, of course, then I was like, of course, it's the masculine's like role to then show up now that they are back in equilibrium, to hold that pull and protect us while we are having our experience. And that is the loving role that we get to play for each other, in the cycle that we get to be in. Is like, okay, you're experiencing a fragility, bring it to the altar of the feminine, let us transmute it for you, and in return you protect us
Whilst you transmute it.
whilst we transmute it. And that's our cycle.
Yeah.
And I was like blown away by that energy, where I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to hold space for the men. And I do this in my one-on-one work also. It's like, I want to hold space for men because I don't want their emotion ability to be seen as weakness. And I don't want their fragility to be something that makes them less than the epitome of who they are and who they came here to be. It's my duty to do that and to serve man in that way. And when I'm in the most integrity and I'm grounded and in alignment with who I am able to transmute that energy and alchemize it in a healthy way. And noticing that while I do that, I'm having these very visceral, emotional experiences, because it's challenging as a woman to not absorb that energy. It takes such strength, inner feminine strength, to hold that and then discharge it and literally give it back to Mother Earth. And give it back to the world.
And then what I love in that moment is the ability to hold that space for you. It's like, oh, now I'm being asked to really reside in the masculine. I'm being offered this duty to hold this woman. And what a gift it is to be able to do that. Like, I'm honored that I get to play that role for you as protector as you do that. It's like, yes, I will answer that call. I will rise to that ask, and I will become and be that person as a thank you, in gratitude. Because if I don't, then then it's, I don't want to say that I failed, but it's like I get to show you the love in doing that, and that's really meaningful for me.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to think about vulnerability, because we are of the belief that vulnerability is actually courageous. It's a very strong thing to do. And it's interesting also when we think about polarities, where it's like, quite typically, and even obviously at the beginning of this episode, we're talking about like the man's gift is his strength and the woman's gift is her intuition. But also like women, and in this particular example, right, like ladies are so strong. We are also so strong. We are both strong as fuck beings. Our strengths show up in different ways. Yours is typically more physical and intellectual. Ours is deeply emotional and intuitive. So the strength of which our connection is created is different. But the strengths are there, and that's what I feel like the healthy connection and healthy emotional depth comes from, is recognizing those strengths and being able to offer them. Because something that comes up for me while you were talking about that is how I can see why and how it can be challenging for some relationships to have the emotional depth that they desire, because in some way it's like the feminine is deeply craving protection, And for some reason, they're feeling like the masculine isn't offering it to them, while also the masculine isn't quite feeling safe enough to share his heart with her for some reason. And so that desire of what we just spoke about becomes very challenging because neither party actually feels safe.
Right. They're not willing to drop into that cycle.
Yeah, and whether it's because the masculine isn't willing to be vulnerable, and so the feminine's always aching for his heart, and in that, it creates this pressure on their container, and it's just like, I mean, it's interesting. The book that we're reading by David Data talks about how the masculine role is to bring depth, and so the feminine can only ever meet the masculine at the level at which he's able to go, and that he offers.
Yeah.
If I'm begging for your vulnerability and your emotionality and you don't want to offer it, that creates so much disconnect in the relationship. And the feminine doesn't feel safe and the man feels annoyed.
Well, like the paradox there for the masculine, or at least for me, is that I get to have the depth of emotion, or I get to be seen as the masculine that I know that I am and can be, by choosing to have the courage to be vulnerable and show up in vulnerability. Like, it's so paradoxical. But the strength, you find the strength of your masculinity by surrendering to the vulnerability of your femininity.
Well, yeah, and just imagine, I tell my clients this, it's like, imagine a life where you didn't hold anything back. Like, you didn't suppress any aspect of yourself. What does that feel like? And 10 times out of 10, everybody goes, wow, that feels so liberating. Oh, I feel like I could do anything. It's like the vulnerability is a part of that equation. If you didn't hold back any emotions and you didn't hold back any infraction point or fear or vulnerability, and you brought it to life and you said, here, whether it's in relationship, whether it's to God, whether it's to Pachamama, whatever your medicine is, when you bring it and you own it, that's how we transmute it.
Yeah.
There's liberation in that. The liberation that people are craving so much comes from the ability to offer all of the experiences, including the most vulnerable ones.
Right. It's recognizing that the vulnerability doesn't take away from you, it adds. It's,
oh my gosh.
It's the courage to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
The strength to be seen. The strength to expose yourself and know that that's safe, and that it will be safe, and that it makes you stronger.
And this is something that is also coming through is, you know, say there is a man out there and he's emotional 24/7. In terms of vulnerability, or in terms of even just the way society sees him, I really want to reframe even that narrative, because all that means is that person, their body is carrying a lot of grief. They've either been through a lot, they've suffered a lot, they're holding a lot. And so a deeply emotional person, all that really says is that their body has stored a lot of this energy. And whether it's now, that it's all coming up and out, like, that is no representation of who that person truly is or who that person can be.
Right.
And so it's of disservice to ourselves and to that person to label them or cast any form of judgment about what they're experiencing, because that person could just be in a dark night of the soul where they're finally getting to feel all of the feelings that were suppressed and oppressed for decades. And now they're finally getting the opportunity to have that and experience that. And I can imagine the person on the other side of somebody who experiences such deep grief all the time is probably one of the most fucking powerful people on the planet. If you can hold and maintain that much energy, and you finally give yourself permission to be with it in order to release and transmute it, there's nothing but sheer power on the other side of that.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And what came to mind there was, in that instance, that person perhaps just doesn't know how to transmute that stuff, because, and likelihood is, as they've grown up and developed, they haven't been taught the tools for transmutation. And so it builds to a point where they can't numb themselves to it anymore.
Yeah.
That it has to come out.
It's coming out one way or the other.
Right.
Yeah.
And they need assistance in discovering how to most effectively alchemize that for themselves or with someone.
Totally. And all that pain, like what we know from our experiences, and I mean, just speaking more to myself, is that underneath all of that grief or all the anger is really a call out for love and support.
Yeah.
You know, so whether it's in relationship or it's in community, that's really what's there. It's like I'm grieving, right? When we're grieving, we can't avoid that feeling, and when we suppress it, it doesn't just disappear. The energy gets stored in our body, and so creating safer spaces for vulnerability, man and woman, is so important, because that's ultimately what brings us to these feelings of liberation that I feel like society is so deeply craving and calling in right now.
Yeah, and for me, that speaks into wanting, like craving those spaces and wanting to express. For me, that speaks into, I mean, this is personal, but I think it holds for the majority of men, this is why there's such an affinity towards sexual expression or sexual exchange, because it is, for me, it's where I feel most, or in the past, it's where I felt most vulnerable.
In sex.
Yeah. And it's a space where that's allowed. So there's a craving for it because it's a space where being vulnerable is acceptable for the masculine. And it's a space to connect with the emotional body and express in the most like masculine way. I think that's why I think personally that's why I have in the past had such a connection with sexual exchange. It's because it's giving me this part of myself that I've been unable to connect with somatically outside of that space.
Yeah.
And essentially be held by a woman or held by the feminine. And yeah, I see the power in that.
Totally. And, you know, this reminds me of one of my partners that I had who was an emotional guy. He was no stranger to crying. And I remember just in my youth feeling that trigger come on. It's like, oh, this guy cries a lot. And I'm just like, what does this mean? And I remember thinking, like, am I the stronger one in the relationship? And having that kind of like challenging belief around what it meant to see a man and his emotions. And over the years, I feel so grateful for the evolution of myself and how I relate to people in general, but also men more specifically. And I feel like now, I mean, that was like over a decade ago, I have such a wider perspective of society at large that really helps inform the current state of beliefs that we're sharing right now. Whereas before, I would have looked at that and it's like, he cries a lot, he's maybe a little bit weak, like, oh, I'm going to have to carry this relationship. Okay, cool, I'm just going to accept that that's the reality, even though it didn't feel in alignment with me. Whereas now, having such a deeper understanding, especially coming from a trauma-informed perspective, I have so much more compassion for what's actually happening rather than cast judgment towards a person who is emotional.
So, thank you for sharing that. I'm curious to know how you might handle that differently now with the evolution that you have embodied now.
Well, it's just about communication. In that relationship, I made an assumption. I immediately correlated emotions, consistent emotions, with weakness. I carried that label. I was like, well, if you keep crying, I'm going to have to wear the pants here. And like, okay. You know, like I had that judgment, that conditioned judgment that men who are vulnerable are weak. And so I was going to have to be strong, right? Even though I wasn't trained as a man to believe that, I still received the energy of that. That was like, man up. Wow. Don't cry so much.
Right.
Like, what do you need to do to get over what's happening? I remember like that was my stance, which even as I say that out loud, feels quite masculine. Sure. Just like, you're crying. What do you need to stop crying? Yeah. You know, like I'm the one supposed to be crying. Yeah. I had already adopted that type of conditioning that's like, don't cry. And there's a part of me that like softened, like when I thought that it was like an occasional thing, I was like, my heart. When I saw that it was a repetitive thing, I started to get nervous.
Right.
And so even just, yeah, coming from a trauma-informed background, it's like I know that there's so much more to the story than, hey, you're crying, that means you're weak. It's like, no, you could be carrying grief.
Right.
You could be carrying trauma.
Right.
You could be in a fucking dark night of the soul. Like, who am I to sit there and say that makes you less than? You are. Like, it's a moment in time. It's a passing moment, right? Emotions are not forever. Sensations are not forever. And so I think my biggest takeaway just from how I've grown from that experience has been that it's impossible, and like I said before, a disservice to judge anybody for the moment in time that they're experiencing, especially if you don't have any information about the undercurrent of what's actually happening there. And there's always space for clarity. I think that's what communication has taught me. So there's always space for clarity. It's like, hey, what's going on here? What's actually happening here? And how can we work together to solve that, to move through that?
Nice.
Can women be too vulnerable in relationship?
I want to say yes. Yes, and?
Here we go. Here we go.
I think it speaks to the same thing. Like, it's okay to be vulnerable in relationship, but if someone's being so vulnerable that they lack the ability to take care of themselves, then I guess it's a frequency thing. It's like happy to hold the space, but I'm not trying to take away the responsibility of, like, this is stuff for you to deal with. And if you're not doing that and you're just residing in the vulnerability, I don't want to say you, if someone is sitting in that and not wanting to step out of that, then it becomes my responsibility, or I'm stuck in a role of forever holding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's nuanced. I would say there's nothing that you could share with me that I would not be able to hold. In that sense, no, I don't think a woman could be too vulnerable. I don't feel like there's something you could express that would be too much. It would be how often you're going to those depths, and are you doing anything about it?
Yeah, it's like, what's the cause of the volatility? Is it the same story over and over and over again, and there's like no positive affirming action out of it?
Right. You're stuck in the role of victim.
Yeah.
In that sense, yes. But if we're thinking in the sense of you going, I want to share this, but I don't know if I can, then no, I don't think there's anything you couldn't share that I wouldn't be comfortable in receiving.
Yeah. I feel that.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you for expressing that.
So, vulnerability in relationships, can either party be too vulnerable? There's a huge asterisk to everything, right? It's like, can you bring everything to the table? Of course. That's why we're creating union. And how can we as independent people reclaim our grounded sovereign energy so we're not just using our relationship as a dumping ground?
Yes.
Or expecting the other person to fix our problems.
Vulnerability is not the removal of sovereignty. For me, that's the key. The vulnerability isn't an attempt to absolve oneself of their sovereignty. It's an attempt to get it back.
Yeah.
through
Exactly.
assistance. So yeah, that's
A safe space to process and recover. Recovery is key. If you don't
Recovery.
recover, of course that's going to be so taxing on the relationship.
Yeah, and it feels like the vulnerability is an ask for, can you help me recover?
Yeah.
Not like a fix this, help.
Yeah.
It's a, I need your strength.
And guidance, right?
Right. To bring me back to my full strength.
Yeah. That's what I love about vulnerability. Is it gets to say, I'm experiencing a moment of weakness. I trust you to hold me in it. This feels scary for me because you could, if you wanted to, or had the nature to, attack me in it because I'm at my most sensitive. And I still choose to bring it to you because in bringing it to you, that is my offering that, at least to me energetically, says, I'm here to overcome this. I'm here to challenge this. I'm here to overcome this.
Yes.
And whether I ask for your feedback or I just ask for you to listen to me,
I like that.
that's what that means to me.
I like that because I feel like I think we have an explicit, but I think we also have an implicit understanding that that's what we're doing when we're coming in vulnerability. I think that's the communication.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's important to be made known in the dynamic around vulnerability. I think that's what helps it.
Yeah, I feel like that's a great discussion for people to have with their partners. It's like, what does vulnerability mean to you? What are the challenges that you find in being vulnerable in relationship? And also just recognizing that sometimes when we ask those questions, we might get a bit of edgy answers in response if our partner feels like they can't express to us for some reason. But to be prepared to have that very honest conversation, because vulnerability is the core of emotional depth to me, is one's ability to share openly, to receive openly, and to transmute it in union with love is what creates that depth. It's also what continues to foster deeper safety, in my opinion. So without vulnerability, it can be very challenging to feel safe.
Yeah, because with each share of vulnerability, would you say that it deepens the level of the relationship? Because there's the understanding that, oh, I'm safe at this level. Oh, I can share this. Oh, I'm safe. Oh, I'm like, okay, how safe can I be?
Yeah. It's like, boom, here's a brick. And then maybe the vulnerability isn't like all the cement that's there. And so it's like you get to pour the cement. It's like, here's another layer. And we just build on that. Those building blocks, right? It's like safety. The more that you express your vulnerabilities to me, fully knowing that I'm not solving your problems, you're still going to resource, you're still going to recover on your own, but that I'm here to love and support you in it. Even me witnessing you having that experience affirms safety, because if you can recover from your own infraction points, we're good, right? Like, because that's all we're really battling. We're battling the extremities of the world around us. We're not actually battling each other.
Right.
We're battling our own infraction points and our own belief systems.
The vulnerability is the proof point of, oh, you've had this challenge and you're proving to me that you can overcome it.
Yeah. To me, that's like fortitude.
Yeah.
Right? Mentally, emotionally, it's like, whew. Like that, to me, granted, there's physical strength, that emotional strength is such a turn on to me. It's like, yes, yeah. You can process it and work through it, and you came out the other side. And not only did you come out the other side, but you're feeling stronger and you're feeling more resilient and more able because you cleared that. That's what I want for men all over the world. Like, clear those infraction points, anything that they feel like prevents them from being their fullest, most embodied, strongest self. Like, your purpose is in all of that. And if you don't feel that or believe that, then of course it'll be hard to feel like you're on purpose, or you won't know what you're doing in life. But when you overcome those, it's like, that was nothing, okay? Because typically what we find is that they're the same infraction points with different masks, right? They're just showing up differently, but it's the same core things. And so the ability to work through that and overcome that in whatever way, shape, or form that is, whether it's in brotherhood, in partnership, or completely independent on your own, it's like, whew, okay, next level.
Right.
Here we go.
Yeah.
That's attractive. That shows strength. That shows emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's so attractive to a woman. That's attractive to me. But I know a lot of women, and a lot of women would agree with that statement also.
Okay. That's good to know. That vulnerability is attractive. It's not just the vulnerability that's attractive. It's the desire to overcome the infraction point that's being brought up in the vulnerability and overcoming it. Yeah. It's the display of strength.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we can crumble, and sometimes crumbling is necessary to rebuild.
Right. It's sacrifice.
But there's still a rebuild, right? It's all about rebuilding and all about coming from that state and activating something that feels more empowering and more aligned so that greater confidence is built. And I believe that. When I show up in vulnerability towards you and I work through it and I come out the other side, I feel stronger because of it.
Yeah.
I feel more connected to you because now you're feeling a deeper part of me. And I just don't feel afraid.
Well, I'm getting to experience the destruction, the sacrifice of the part of you that held that infraction, and the building up of this new part of you, this stronger part of you. And I get to go on that journey with you. And that's invaluable.
Yeah, I think it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
I feel complete with that.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for going on that journey with me.
So welcome.
Thank you for going on this journey with me.
So many amazing layers to conscious intimacy.
Oof.
So many things. And I'm so grateful that we've been given the opportunity to express ourselves and share our reflections and our stories with the world. Because, there are so many layers. And we get the opportunity to educate through awareness and just by sharing. Yeah,
well, I feel like not only that, it's nice to be able to share and offer people their insights, but I feel like for me, it's insightful in having this conscious understanding around stuff that's been going on with us, through us, for us, that hasn't been explicitly discussed at this level, and it's that feels nice.
It feels so powerful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And cat.